Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to another Oxus Society's Twitter space. Today, we're going to be talking about the future of the Uzbek cotton trade. We have four fantastic panelists with us today, and one's still on her way, but we'll kick off on time. There she is. There's Dilfuza there. So send her a kick in. So joining us today is the fantastic Steve Swerdlow, who's a professor at the University of Southern California. We've got Jen Murtazashvilli, who's the president of the Center for Eurasian Studies. We'll have Dilfuza Kurolova, who's a human rights lawyer, and Jonas Astrup, who's the chief of the International Labour Organization. And today we're going to be discussing the future of the Uzbek cotton industry. And I'm going to start with Jen. What is the biggest change you've seen over why are we having this conversation now? What's been the big change in the last year or so in the Uzbek cotton industry?
Well, I think that what we've seen since 2017, 2018, was really this effort by the government of Uzbekistan to get rid of forced and child labor. And this is not an easy decision, I think, for the government. I think for many of us on the outside, it looks like, well, why can't they just do this so quickly? This cotton is so deeply ingrained in the Uzbek political economy. It has been since the Soviet period. The Uzbekistan as a republic was created almost to breed cotton. And the reliance on, child labor, on forced labor, they got rid of child labor a few years ago, getting rid of child labor now, so much of the political economy depends on this resource. And so the decision of the government to do this, I think, changing these practices, which are so deeply ingrained, but also shifting the entire country's political economy is a big decision. So many people get rents and profits from this cotton. So I think this is a monumental change. It happened, I think, in terms of independence, it was 30 years after independence, but very quickly President Mirziyoyev decided to make that decision. And it's good to see the independent, organizations like ILO and the local human rights organizations who have been observing these changes. And I should say that some of the human rights organizations that have been involved in observing and monitoring what's going on. I know Steve can say a little bit more about this. These are people who I worked with, 20, 25 years ago in Uzbekistan, who were treated very badly and who were, faced physical threats and were harmed physically for their work in human rights. And the fact that they are now involved in monitoring and working with the government to monitor this situation and have access to the fields. I think more still can be done, but this is really an important moment for Uzbekistan right now.
So, Dilfuza, what does this mean for the country? How is this being seen by the Uzbek locals here?
Hi to everyone. Thanks a lot for inviting me. Actually, this news was very positively accepted because, of course, this cotton boycott and the issue of child and forced labor in Uzbekistan was perceived not well, but when it was wavered, especially when it was the first taking off the child labor boycott. I remember when there was different discussions like, oh yeah, so now we are free and our cotton will be sold in different countries, especially in the world famous brands. But then again, international community and even ministry, and there are two types of boycotts. And of course, the last one that has been widely spread information, it gave a lot of energy, and also it's a kind of appreciation for human rights and organizations, especially civil society groups, individuals who were fighting for these rights, appreciation of their work. Because they do understand, and we also as a community understand, if they were not starting from 2010 and 13, this firm demanding from the country, demanding from the country and from international organization holding accountability of the cotton sector, especially on human rights, I don't think that such a progress would ever happen. But on the other hand, we also understand as a community that this is only because we have a strong political will. Without a political will, I don't think that even this shift in 2017, when in one day, people were sent back to their homes, and then say, Ministry of Education said, "Oh, we did not know that sending students to fields is forced labor." So I think, of course, it's lots of let's say positive, but on the other hand, it's also new challenges, because the world is facing different types of crisis, and there's also a warning that more migrants can come back, and the sector can again have a reverse let's say effect on that.
So Jonas, you've been quite involved in all these campaigns. Why have these laws been changed? Is it just out of the goodness of Mirziyoyev's heart, or is it finally the international pressure that's been put on Uzbekistan that has pushed through these changes?
That's a good question. In my experience, and I've been living and working in Uzbekistan since 2017, so for 5 years, and I've been working solely on this particular issue. In my experience, and when I have conversation with decision makers in the country, I actually don't think that Uzbekistan did this for the external pressure. I think they did it for themselves. I think that they did it to be able to create jobs in the country. The whole reform strategy has been to reposition Uzbekistan away from being an exporter of raw cotton and to become a producer and a manufacturer of textile and garment products, and thereby move up the value chain, boost the economy of Uzbekistan, and create jobs. Now, part of that, of course, has been to overcome the the international perceptions and the international reactions that were put in place in the past. But fundamentally speaking, I think Uzbekistan have done this for themselves. I have never met an Uzbek who has defended child labor or forced labor in the cotton harvest. Everybody wants to see an end to this, and everybody has been working together. And I think it's true that Mirziyoyev provided the political will and the space for this to happen.
Steve, obviously, without going too far into an economics lecture, in Uzbekistan, it's much more expensive to produce cotton than if you compare it to, let's say, a Pakistan or in India, where there is more water and lower labor costs. Without this effectively free labor in the cotton industry, can the cotton industry in Uzbekistan survive? Or frankly, as Jonas said, they're just going to move further up the value chain and move to effectively garment creation?
Well, yeah, and hello to everyone, including Ambassador Vahabov, I see on the Twitter space. The industry has definitely changed dynamically in the last several years, and there was a big announcement a few weeks ago now. The international coalition called the Cotton Campaign, which brought together civil society activists, apparel makers outside the country, and other partners in labor, announced that they were formally ending what they called the pledge, which was a pledge by hundreds of companies not to source Uzbek cotton because of the forced labor issue. Now, that ended formally a few weeks ago. It was a big announcement. And as I think Jonas and Dilfuza and Jen have said, it was the result of this really unique combination and collaboration between the government, civil society, the private sector. But what I've been witnessing over the past year, and I've been working very closely with partners on the ground, is that Uzbekistan is moving into what they call the cluster system, which is a collection of private entities that are now vertically working in collaboration in various sectors of the country, where you have the manufacture, the harvesting, the processing, and the sale of cotton, all in clusters around the country. Now, they have been increasing their productivity. We do see, as Dilfuza mentioned, we still have a lot of path ahead in terms of enforcing workers' rights, ensuring that there's freedom of association. But there does seem to be a movement towards mechanization, less and less hand-picked cotton happening every year, lower and lower percentage of land actually being devoted to hand-picked cotton, and also, of course, higher wages in the sector. But what we want to see, of course, is that worker protections are in place, and that workers have a voice, that they're able to effectively communicate conditions that they see on the ground to the clusters, to the main offices in Tashkent, and get those complaints answered. So there are a lot of changes, and I'm very hopeful that things are moving in the right direction, but it's going to take continued political will, continued engagement by civil society, and a real collaboration going forward.
So, Jen, obviously, this has been quite a successful campaign by some of the workers' rights advocates here. Are there lessons that people, that workers' rights advocates in Tajikistan or Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan can take from Uzbekistan and extrapolate and bring back to their own countries?
I think it's actually quite hard to generalize from this case because, so much of this change depended on the changes that were brought from the top by President Mirziyoyev. And that happened very suddenly. So this was not a change that came from below. This was a change that came from the top. So when you have, these closed political societies, it's really hard to engender that kind of change from below. So that's why I don't think there's a lot of lessons here, unfortunately, for Tajikistan and Turkmenistan. And I would agree actually with what Jonas has said, is that, while the international community and we could debate the effectiveness of these sanctions on the changes that we've seen, I think this is a question that really deserves a lot more of our attention, given everything that's going on in the world right now and our own discussion about the impact of sanctions. But if we look at what's happened here, the government of Uzbekistan made a decision in its own internal development strategy when President Mirziyoyev came to power about what kind of country it wants Uzbekistan to be. How is it going to deal with issues of rural poverty, rural development? These are issues that were not tackled for a very long time. And in fact, like President Mirziyoyev, he began to talk about poverty. He began to talk about problems in rural areas. You begin to see these issues described. And of course, cotton is really at the heart of this. And so if you have, remember President Karimov talked about labor migrants and criticized them for leaving the country. And if you don't have jobs for people, and picking cotton becomes one thing for people to do, but is this the economy that you want? Is this economy that's going to employ, the huge amounts of young people that are coming into the economy? And I think this is where Jonas's point is really on target, is that there had to be a structural shift in the nature of the economy. So I do think that we can't really have a very serious conversation about the future of Uzbek cotton or the future of Uzbekistan without getting into these really important economic issues about labor, about the assets that the country has and where people are going to work. And Karimov talked about shifting away from cotton for a very long time, but he didn't really do that to the extent to which we're seeing now. And so there is this desire to make the country more industrialized, to move away from water-intensive agricultures. There's now, we haven't even talked about the environmental issues and why cotton may not be the best choice for Uzbekistan. So I think these are really important issues that we really have to talk about. And I know that many people, not just civil society advocates, but incredibly talented young economists who are looking at Uzbekistan are trying to tackle is thinking about what the future of this economy looks like, given the assets that the country has, especially in terms of labor.
Dilfuza, obviously with Uzbekistan going through this change in its economy, are we already starting to see particularly younger people move from these outer cities like Bukhara and Samarkand closer to Tashkent, where the sort of more industrial areas of Uzbekistan are? Is that change already starting to take place, or is it still a few years away? I think you're on mute, Dilfuza.
I'm sorry, I think I lost the connection. So can you please repeat the question?
No problem at all. So obviously with this change in the Uzbek economy, we are starting to see, more industrialized cities. Are we starting to see young people move from outer cities like Samarkand and Bukhara towards Tashkent because the jobs are concentrated in the more industrial areas like Tashkent? Or, is this something that's still a few decades away?
It's a very interesting question because the more I, walk in the streets and the more market I look in the economic sector, the more people are really coming to Tashkent. It's very centralized. It's very it's a lot of opportunity in Tashkent, in central cities, let's say. Of course, we have lots of government programs. Let's say there is a specific program for youth empowerment. This is led by Agency of Youth Affairs, where an enormous amount of loans and support is provided to young people who would like to actually make their businesses in regions. I know that people are using it. However, in district level, in regional level, we see that infrastructure is not taking place there. It's one thing. Another thing is about land allocation, especially in agriculture sector. I know that a few weeks ago there was a government decision. I think it was a very wonderful decision when hakimiyats, actually hakims and governors, they were taken off the power of allocating land plots in agriculture sector, which is, I think, very good, because this also cause corruption schemes, because there are few scandal cases when $100,000 people are bribing in order to get land spots in for constructions, for agriculture, and etc., which is of course one of the pushing factor for youth to come, let's say, Tashkent or Tashkent region, because here is, I think, more regulated rather than in regions and districts. But again, this legal framework that is widely spreading, that is adopting every, let's say, month, not year, not in a year or two. We can see this trend maybe in 5 years, because again, agriculture is not very attractive for young people. I think it's more for business and farmers who either they have family members as a farmers, and that's why they know how it has been done and how to operate this business, or they are more mature people who have more knowledge, assets, and financial possibilities in order to make this business, especially as Steve said about the clusters, because clusters, again, there are two opinion in among specialists and experts. One is cluster is very good because it gives you a chain in the business, and it's good for the business people as well and for the industries. The example of this Fergana textile cluster. But the second opinion is also going that some of the clusters are really taken by some political exposed peoples. We see that there are connections are involved. We see that it's not very effective for the business itself. So it's I think it's now we are now trying, Uzbekistan is trying really hard to find the way which will be more effective in the cotton sector, in agriculture sector, and especially for young people.
So we already have questions rolling into our DMs from people who are quite regulars at these things. So if you have a question for our fantastic panel, you can DM the Oxus Society's Twitter account, and we can pose that question to our fantastic panel. Jonas, this question's for you. What does Tashkent have to do to move to this new economic model? What reforms need to be made before they can start to look at themselves in the next level of the supply chains?
Thank you. Before I get to that, maybe can I just come back to what Dilfuza just said?
Of course.
Because yes, because this thing about are young people moving to Tashkent as a result of you say a growth in the textile and garment industry. I actually don't think they are. And if they're moving to Tashkent, they're not moving to Tashkent for jobs in the textile and garment industry. In fact, and let me take a step back, because I have a private sector background. I used to work in the toy industry. I've worked in textile and garment industry and in the mining industry. And I've always worked in supply chains. So I've literally spent, the last 20 years going in and out of factories in China, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Bangladesh, and all over the world. And when you fly into these big cities in these countries, you always see the same thing. You fly into the capital or a large city, and you see sort of a ring, an industrial ring around the city, where you typically have factories, and those factories pretty much look the same in all of the countries I just mentioned. They have production buildings, and then they have dormitories on the premises. These dormitory buildings are typically, 3, 4, 5-story buildings with rooms where the workers live. And these workers come in from the countryside. They go to the big city to work in a factory for 3, 4, maybe 5 years. They live in a dormitory. They maybe in the peak season work excessive hours, up to 18 hours a day, for example, in some industries. And they do that to make enough money to go back to where they came from, to buy a house or to get married, etc. This is not what we are seeing in Uzbekistan. If you get on a flight, you fly into Tashkent, you don't see an industrial ring around Tashkent. You don't see an industrial zone. You don't see these factories around Tashkent with dormitory buildings. In fact, all these facilities are located in the provinces and in the districts. And this comes back to this, as Steve referenced, this vertically integrated cluster system. The processing and manufacturing facilities are located in the provinces and in the districts. So when you go and see them, they look different from what you see in most other countries, in that there are no dormitories. And so you don't have young people moving to work in a factory. The people who work in the facilities are local people. And I think this is interesting. And to your question about when will this change? When will Uzbekistan look like the other countries? I say, I hope never. Because I think that there are so many positive aspects of having these facilities in the local communities. For example, imagine if the manager and the worker, if their kids go to the same school. Imagine if they meet in the local mosque. Imagine if they all belong to the same local community. I think that does tremendous things for social relations in the workplace. I think it also changes, and this is something I've seen firsthand when I worked in the mining industry, where you typically have an asset that you can't move. So you have to have good community relationships. Otherwise, the local community may block the road or in any other way sort of try to obstruct your operations. So you have to work on your community relationships. And this is the same for these textile clusters and other facilities related to textile and garments. They are in the local communities. They have to have good community relations because that is where their workers are from. That is where they're going to get their future workforce. And so my advice, and this is something that we very consistently say to the government and to the employers and to the trade unions of Uzbekistan is, don't change that. Keep your manufacturing facilities out in the provinces and in the districts. Keep these jobs local and nurture these relationships between these social interactions, not only within the community, but bring it into the workspace. Thank you.
Very well said. Steve, what do you think the next round of reforms economically will Tashkent be looking at? What is the next step in Mirziyoyev's plan here?
Right. Well, I'll speak more from the perspective of those that I'm working really closely with in civil society and the private sector. We've been focused very, very closely on southern Uzbekistan in the last few months and talking to the human rights defenders out there and the private businesses. I want to take a step back and make sure we're not romanticizing this, as Dilfuza and Jonas and Jen have said. This is really difficult work. The workers that we interviewed, for example, recently, they pick between 100 kilos, 150 kilos, sometimes 200 kilos a day. They work at least 12 hours, well, 9 to 12 hours, but in many cases, we spoke to workers that spend up to 14 hours or more. They're also sometimes in transportation for 2 hours to the fields, 2 hours back. And so, there's still a pretty huge disparity between the actual cotton pickers out there in the fields and the management, the people running the clusters. That gap has to be bridged. And in order to make sure that this is an effective system, a fair and equitable system, a system that protects the worker and the manufacturer, I think what we need to see, what I'm advocating for as strongly as possible, is that we establish feedback mechanisms where those clusters that are doing more and more work and as I said, moving more towards mechanization, but still relying on hand-picked cotton, they need to hear from workers. They need to know what their conditions are, give them protective equipment. We do have some, I don't know how isolated these are, but at least we are seeing situations where workers will bring their cotton at the end of the day to the person that's called the brigadier, right? The person who is responsible for collecting the cotton, weighing the cotton, looking at the quality. And often there's no one necessarily checking to make sure that they get paid the right amount. They're weighing that cotton. Sometimes there may be a dispute that the cotton has sticks or rocks in it or is not high quality. And so in order to make sure that the system is working well, I think what we need to see are, like I said, feedback mechanisms established, but also workers' rights organizations that are able to do trainings, that are able to work with the companies, the brigadiers, the cotton picker leaders, and make sure that everyone is aware of the reforms. And I should say the Ministry of Labor in Uzbekistan has been out front, and they've established a pretty good database and a feedback mechanism for people to report timely complaints. But that has to be, I think that has to be all throughout the country, and it has to be happening very strongly within civil society and independent civil society. That's where I think the future is. But also, of course, let's say that mechanization and less hand-picked cotton over time, I think, is also where this should be going.
So if you just tuned in, this is a live Twitter Space panel regarding the future of the Uzbek cotton industry. And Jen, I'm going to throw this to you. Frankly, this has been, it's not quite a victory lap yet. It is a good move forward. Do you think that human rights and labor rights advocates in Uzbekistan will continue to just stick on the cotton issue, or is there another big fight that everyone will turn their attention to and put their energy at?
Well, I think that I would defer to Steve on this question because he's really the expert here. But I think it's a mischaracterization to say that this is the issue that they've been focused on. I think this is an area where they have been allowed to be active, but there are many other issues where civil society and human rights groups have been active inside of Uzbekistan. I think this is one that the outside world's paying attention to, more than others. But I want to just, echo a couple of comments that I've heard from Steve, Jonas, and Dilfuza today. The history of this cotton and the reason it has grown is so, and I'm going to go back to this because it's really important to understand how this change occurred and how significant this is. While the reform process has been imperfect, this is a huge structural change that's happened in this economy, and not just the economy, but as Dilfuza talked about, as Steve talked about, if we look at and Jonas, the local governance dimensions of this are huge, because the entire subnational governance authority in Uzbekistan for so many years, especially during the Soviet period and even during the Karimov period, was centered around the distribution of assets, fertilizer, inputs, everything that goes into picking cotton. If you were to watch TV, a decade ago in the fall, there was like a race to see which province was collecting cotton. You turn on the news every night during cotton harvest season, you could see which province was in the lead in terms of collecting its quota. So cotton, this isn't just an industry. We can't just compare it to another country. What the role that cotton played in the Uzbek economy was, I think, unlike anything that we've seen in the world. And the people of Uzbekistan paid an enormous price for this, economically, environmentally. And it's something that I think united a lot of political leaders. How do you make a change on this issue? But on the other hand, when so many people are profiting from this, when so many tax resources are dependent upon this, when so many foreign currency reserves are coming from this cotton, how do you make these kinds of changes? And so what Jonas here has stressed is that what we are not seeing is sort of Bangladesh. We're not seeing the kinds of industrialization around this cotton issue. Why are people moving to Tashkent? I think a lot of this also has to do with the Propiska issue. We haven't talked about that, and how much of that Propiska issue and the registration issue actually had to do with cotton and agriculture and preventing the kind of rapid urbanization that many officials feared would occur, that would turn Tashkent into a place resembling some larger cities in the global south. So keeping these investments local, not having those industrialized zones around Tashkent, is doing something to absorb, I think, the excess labor that you're seeing in rural areas where population growth is really, really high. So yes, I'll defer to Steve on the question of human rights, but I think we have to understand sort of the big picture here about why this is significant, why it was so hard to do. And, I don't think there's going back on this issue. I think this will be one thing that's very hard to reverse, but I think going forward, how can Uzbekistan has a really incredible vision for its economic future, but how can the political economy of the country be harnessed to support that? And I think there's still a lot of work to be done to support the kinds of changes that need to be happened to sustain the economy in the future.
So Dilfuza, obviously the Uzbek cotton industry actually had some Western attention. It is something that people who did know anything about the region could kind of associate with Uzbekistan. What do you think the next issue in Uzbekistan that can be brought to the surface? Is there some other issue that people in Uzbekistan can push for that will get Western attention, that will be the next big fight in the sort of media now?
I think, of course, in human rights community, we have still the issue of rule of law and the issue of transitional justice. This is the questions that human rights community is always concerning and raising it quite high. I think these questions actually were quite often even addressed at the highest level. Like president is always pointing out about transitional justice, torture issues, and I think one of the things that as a human rights lawyer and practicing in international law, for me is and we talk a lot about this with Steve as well and other colleagues about role of UN treaty bodies. As you know, Uzbekistan has been there were 2 committee reports this year, February and March, and more upcoming. Next year, we will be We will be providing our country reports on CRPD. Then that at the beginning of last year, President Mirziyoyev he promised and said that OPCAT will be ratified in Uzbekistan. I think this is also another thing that we can stress on as a community, not only in like attention of international, but it's also attention of national human rights communities and civil society, because it's also important to provide, as it was mentioned, about feedback mechanisms. I'm working in this feedback mechanism in cotton sector since 2016, and I remember how I was like sitting in a trade union, Federation of Trade Union, and Jonas, you can add on that as well. When we came and said like people have to call and not be afraid of being fired or filed somewhere, people were not even believing on that, because we have a law on citizen complaints, and according to this law, whoever is calling to the government of organizations, they have to provide their passport details, they have to provide their all other details, and etc. While in cotton sector, it was important, vital to have this channel of anonymous complaint mechanisms. And now, because I'm observing it over the years, this year there were almost none of the cases, like people were calling. Of course, they were complaining on different issues, but not related pretty much on the cotton and forced labor. But people are really willing.
Dilfuza seems to have dropped out there, but that's okay. So while Dilfuza jumps back on, Jonas, do you think this is going to have a positive or negative outcome? Oh, there we go. Back.
In this, I don't know, district, they did not give a salary, or they did not.
Seems to have dropped out again. That's all right. Okay, Dilfuza, can you hear me? That's all right. So, Jonas, do you think this is going to have a positive or negative outcome for the region? Do you think the victories gained here will spread out through neighboring countries, or frankly, this is a very localized victory for the labor pool?
That's a very good question, and I think the answer to it is that depends on what kind of benefits Uzbekistan sees. So if you look at the reform process in Uzbekistan, and if you look at these changes that were initiated, say, in 2017, this entire shift, and Jen is right when she says that changing the agricultural model is extremely complex. There are all kinds of issues about production inputs, about the quota system being abolished, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Turning the agricultural model, I would almost say upside down, privatizing, liberalizing, that is a very complex process. And in any sort of change process like that, you're going to have winners and you're going to have losers. You're going to have people who benefited from the old system who won't have access to these benefits any longer. And then you're going to have new winners who are able to grow their businesses as a result of the agricultural changes to the agricultural system. So what I'm trying to say is that by embarking on this reform process, Uzbekistan took a risk. And I think other countries in the region are observing how this is going to turn out. If, for example, and I'm very happy that finally the boycott of Uzbek cotton, textile, and garments are lifted, because quite frankly, one of the worst case scenarios would have been if Uzbekistan had embarked on all these reforms in order to realize the strategy of moving up the value chain and moving away from being an exporter of raw cotton and being an exporter of textile and garments, because that is really what the whole reform process here hinges on. And if you at the same time boycott the country, then it would not be possible for Uzbekistan to realize this process. So the other countries in the region will be looking at Uzbekistan and saying, let's see how this works out. If Uzbekistan are going to be able to create a lot of jobs, if Uzbekistan is going to be able to position itself successfully as an exporter to international brands and retailers of especially garment products, high-value garment products, then I think it's going to be attractive for other countries to follow. If, on the other hand, Uzbekistan for whatever reason, and the boycott would have been one of those reasons, would not have been able to realize that and gain those benefits, then I don't think it would have been an attractive proposition for other countries to follow.
So I would just want to jump in here, because I think Jonas makes a really important point that I almost think in some ways this boycott, the sanctions on this, or the penalties on this were lifted a little too late. I think that that Uzbekistan had made pretty significant progress on this and really demonstrated a commitment to this several years ago. And I think as Uzbekistan approached COVID and the economic impact of that having that lifted a little bit earlier would have given, I think, more momentum to the reforms. Because I don't think, I'll leave it to Jonas or Steve to say a little bit more about what they've observed, and Dilfuza as well. But the significant changes between this year and last year don't seem to have warranted sort of the significant change that we saw from the boycott.
So we are coming towards the end of our time here, and as our panelists have very busy schedules, so we're just going to do a bit of a quick, 60-second, 90-second summary of approaching this question from different angles. I'm going to start with Steve here. In a bit of a 90-second summary, what is the future of the Uzbek cotton industry from a human rights perspective? Do you think we are going to see better rights, or this is as good as it gets for Uzbekistan?
I'm glad you asked me about human rights this time, not economics. I think that the future is the freedom of association, collective bargaining rights. We have Nabahori Mamava here with us on the Twitter space, which she's done some fantastic interviews with the Ministry of Justice of Uzbekistan, which is the body that is responsible for granting registration to non-governmental organizations. And 5 years into this process, we still see a Byzantine bureaucracy that is slow to register independent organizations. And I think that's what we really want to see. And we need to see, I mentioned before, feedback mechanisms, workers' rights organizations. What we want to see is a process where, from the president on down, it's clear that critical independent organizations have an environment in which they can operate, they can train workers, brigadiers, cotton picker leaders, managers. That's really important. We also want to see the emergence and the appearance of genuinely independent collective bargaining organizations, unionization, which is something that obviously makes the corporate actors very nervous, but is very, very important to see this move in the right direction. And overall, we could talk for a long time about human rights in general, but I think very important for Uzbekistan's cotton industry and this issue is freedom of speech, freedom of expression. We have seen for some time now reforms stalling. We just saw Amnesty International put out a report very recently about the stalling of reforms in that area. Bloggers that have been unfortunately gone back to prison. That's what I've tracked for many years, is the release of political prisoners and activists, which is a very, very hopeful sign. But unfortunately, we have seen some efforts to move backwards. And I think that's something where we want to see a renewed commitment from President Mirziyoyev and the government to send a strong message that critical voices, including bloggers, journalists, and everyone else, including independent researchers, have a right to speak out. So if we don't have that, we really don't have anything else. So amidst all the good news, we need to renew our commitment to human rights in Uzbekistan and have a stronger voice for all actors here. So overall, it's good news, and there's a lot of progress in this realm. But without freedom of expression and a stronger civil society, we won't be able to sustain these changes into the future.
So Dilfuza, just in a quick 60 seconds, how do you think this will change the culture in Uzbekistan? Do you think this is the first step down a road of, a possible path to democracy, a much more liberal society, or, let's not get ahead of ourselves? That's okay. We'll circle back to Dilfuza a bit later. She's obviously having a bit of problems with her VPN. Jen, how do you think this will change the overall structure of Uzbek's working society? Do you think this is the first step on great things, or is the cotton industry just a beast on its own, and frankly Uzbekistan is business as usual going forward?
Well, I don't think any place is sort of standing still, and I don't think we know where any place is going. It's certainly not business as usual. I think a lot is changing, and I think one of the positive things that we're seeing in terms of the government's attitude towards the economy, which I think if we look at the reforms over the past 5 years, the economic reforms are clearly the bright side. And this is where it's easy to talk about the positive sum gains for society, and that there's an understanding that the fundamentals of the economy that upon which it was based were not sound, and we're not producing things that could generate stability for the future. We're not generating things that could pull people out of poverty. I think the government talks about poverty now. This is a new thing to even admit that there's poverty. So, but how the country is going to deal with this, I'm really concerned. Given the dynamics of the sanctions, how the sanctions will affect the Uzbek economy, what's going to happen to labor migrants as they head back to Uzbekistan, as they inevitably will as a result of this economic shock. There's, I think, greater urgency for the government to engage in more serious economic reforms to carry out the things that they had discussed. So I think cotton is just one bit small part of it, because I think the role of cotton in the economy has actually shrunk in the past several years, and certainly has shrunk since independence. So the country is certainly diversifying, and this is an important step in that direction.
Jonas, so throwing to you now. Jonas, is the future of the Uzbek cotton industry the future of Uzbekistan? Are they tied together, or is there a brighter world going forward after these reforms?
I'm a firm believer in a brighter world, definitely, and I think I would predict, and this may come as a surprise to some, but I actually believe that in a couple of years you're going to see Uzbekistan become a net importer of raw cotton, and so I think that speaks to how important this industry is going to be for job creation and for developing the economy. If I can just spend a very short time just following up on something which Jen said, which I think is extremely important: the sanctions. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sanction are having and will have huge impacts on Uzbekistan. We have access to data from labor migrants in Russia. We know that 25% of labor migrants in Russia would like to return now, or are looking to return now. Another 25% wants to return in the next, let's say, couple of weeks to a month. They're probably waiting for the next paycheck, etc. They're saying that they want to return unless the situation improves. And so maybe the situation won't improve. So you're having a very, very significant number of people looking to return to Uzbekistan. Secondly, for those who remain in Russia, if they have jobs, those jobs are paid in rubles, and there are problems getting the remittances back to Uzbekistan. About 13% of the GDP of the country is remittances. This is extremely important and has a significant impact on local communities. And just lastly, the cotton campaign boycott meant that Uzbekistan could not develop its industry in the West. And so when you analyze where is the main export market for the textile and garment industry in Uzbekistan today, it is in fact Russia. So as the Russian economy is rapidly crumbling, that is also going to have an adverse effect on the Uzbek industry. And the last thing of this impact is logistics. How are you going to get a container out of Uzbekistan? Currently, you can look at a map and figure out that there are some challenges there that needs to be overcome. So we as the international community needs to stand up and help Uzbekistan accelerate the development of the textile and garment industry in order to be able to create these jobs. And we as the ILO are going to do that by accelerating the implementation of the Better Work program in Uzbekistan. And we're currently busy conducting a feasibility study to allow for a fast-track implementation of the Better Work program in Uzbekistan. Thank you.
And our final guest for today, Dilfuza, how do you think this, in 90 seconds, this change in the cotton industry will change the culture in Uzbekistan? Do you think this is the first sign in good things to come?
Of course, I think it's very positive for the country. But I just want to add what Steve was mentioning. So freedom of speech is very important, because I struggled a lot now to connect to Twitter since we still have to, use VPN. So coming back to the cotton sector, I truly believe that this growth in the cotton sector will, of course, affect on economic development in the country. It will create more job opportunities. But again, this migration situation in the world, Russian impact, because it's a currency exchanges, it's also exporting means. This all will definitely affect and will have another wave of let's say challenges to the country. But now I think the government is taking a lot of measures in order to prevent these negative consequences to the sector, especially cotton and agriculture sector. And together with this, I think there will be other opportunities for Uzbekistan as well, not to export neighboring countries, but also exporting to far west or far east, and then be the main exporter of the cotton, because it's what we're famous of.
We seem to have a bit of technical issues there again, but I think that very well illustrates Dilfuza's point there, that she's having to use a VPN because of the fact there is this restrictions on a lot of things in Uzbekistan. So that does bring us to the end of our time today, and I want to thank everyone who tuned into this Twitter space. I always love doing these ones and talking about it, Central Asia and what's going on. I want to thank our panelists, Steve Swerdlow, Dilfuza Kurolova, Jennifer Murtazashvilli, and Jonas Astrup. All of you were absolutely fantastic today, and I'm big fans of all of your work. Thanks for being on. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sending questions through as well. And we'll be back in a few weeks with another topic to discuss. But if you want to hear more about this particular issue, you can tune into the Oxus podcast, Spotlight on Central Asia, where we do talk about this a bit more in more detail. But in the meantime, thank you so much for jumping on tonight. And it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Oxus.
Thank you very much.